All right, welcome, folks. This is the next module. We're protecting your assets. Legal. Before we get going through this, I am not a tax attorney. I'm not a lawyer. Everything here is things that I put into practice myself, but with the aid of my professional team. If you guys need a referral, let us know. So here we go. Asset protection. You've got like a web of all these things that you've heard out there: umbrella insurance, you've got liability insurance, you've got different entities, and how does it fit with estate planning and taxation? You've got a lot of these layers to this, and we're going to start to break these things down into steps. And we have to think the reason why we're doing this. And sometimes it may totally conflict with paying less taxes that we've talked in the previous section, but it puts you in a better position for risks of lawsuits. This becomes more of a bigger issue for those of us who are higher net worth. When I was in my 20s and early 30s, and I just was playing around with little rental properties under $1 million net worth, I wasn't a big target to be sued because I didn't really have anything to lose. It wasn't really worth the calorie expenditure from somebody to come after me to get under a million bucks. But as investors get a higher net worth, certainly into the 2 to 3 million plus range, a lot of these things are a must. And especially if the things that you do at your profession, of course, you should have your own professional insurance, but you're still a big target there, if not only because you have a high income. So some of the doctors, dentists out there may choose to go up a step or two. If you're just some guy who works a sales job or in corporate America, you may not have too much extra liability, but we all run around, drive cars, interact in public very safely. But the problem is the other people out there. And we live in a litigious society here in America. And the other thing is we also live in a somewhat unfair legal system. The reason why I invest in America a lot is we have a good legal system. And that kind of sounds a little contradictory. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not always 99, 100% of the time things work its way out where the people who were in clear conscience did what they're supposed to do win these types of battles. And if anything, we do know that most of these lawsuits end up in settlements. It's very rare to take everything to trial to get to that point. It's usually settled. And if you're going in with that mindset, all right, we're not going to battle this out in the courtroom floor. The legal team are just going to go back and forth and argue the merits of the case, then these types of entity structures and things we're going to be talking about is going to be ultimately what decides how good or how bad that settlement is. And we're going to be getting a little bit into irrevocable trust, taking your money offshore. But I would say unless your net worth is over 5 to 10 million, that a lot of that stuff doesn't really make too much sense. It's expensive. It's cumbersome. I think the things that I wanted to point out today, especially, again, this is not legal advice, is to make sure that you're at least on the same planet with it. If your net worth is $4 million and don't even have a simple Holdco LLC structure, then hopefully today this was that wake up call for you. So I'll refer to this image here on the right side. And the way that this is built up is you start to build your protections in rings. And think of this like a castle as a metaphor. You've got a moat, you've got archers, you've got walls. But what if you have a little castle to protect? And that's what's in these smaller rings here. The way to read this chart is if you go up this side, this is basically how much net worth, things you have to lose, and it goes sequentially. And on this side is what it costs you to perform some of these things or put some of these protections into place. And then the middle ring is, and we'll go through these steps. I think everybody here listening to this, you guys are probably in these first few rings at the very least. So we'll start there. Step 0 is insurance, right? You've got your car insurance. You've got your malpractice insurance if you're a medical professional. If you're not, you've got umbrella insurance. And if you're a doctor, you should have both. You should have all 3 of those things. auto malpractice and umbrella insurance to cover most lawsuits. And this is typically what most frivolous lawsuits are trying to go after, the insurance claims. We've had probably dozens of these types of insurance come back on our thousands and thousands of rental properties. This is after a while, we got all frustrated of it, but then we just learned the game that this is what frivolous lawyers will do. And a lot of times what they're trying to do is just get the low hanging fruit, trying to figure out what is your deductible and what is your coverage and just going in right under that because they know that they can get that number with the least amount of legal resistance on our side. And what I would probably say, and I've detached myself over the years from these types of things, like perhaps desensitized myself. I don't take things personally anymore these days. If people want to spend 25, 50, $100,000 to collect 25, 50, $100,000, then so be it, right? That's just how some people are. And unfortunately, there's a lot of lawyers out there that kind of trick their clients into thinking they may have a case when they really don't. So they can just churn those hours on them. As the saying goes, in any type of dispute like this or divorces, it's the lawyers that get rich at the end of the day. For our purposes of this talk today, you put your umbrella insurance amount to a point where it will defend off for essentially, here's the umbrella. Dude, just take that. Leave me alone, man. So for most of us here, you probably make a lot of sense to mimic where your net worth is. At least get $1 million in our FOOM group. This is the first thing that we have people to get some good momentum moving forward is to go get an umbrella policy out there where there's multiple carriers. A lot of times you can tack it on to your auto insurance. It's rather cheap, especially if you get it tacked onto your auto insurance. It falls behind the auto insurance. So that's why it's so cheap. But just to give you a round ballpark, maybe $400 or $500 for $1 million, plus or minus 20, 30%, adjusted for inflation, depending on when you're watching this video. You should be able to get it for under $1,000. This peace of mind per year, I think it's just a no-brainer. If you wanted to double it, triple it, get $2 or $3 million. If your net worth is $1 million or $2 million, go ahead, knock yourself out. But if you don't have umbrella insurance, dude, what are you doing? Get that yesterday. All right. So now going into step one here, you've got some rental properties or passive in investments. Maybe you own your own practice. You have a business. The idea is to start setting up your entity structures. We live here in America. The LLC is a great legal entity that separates personal assets from business assets and also business assets from business assets. You've got little rental properties. Those are typically higher liability than your holdings in passive syndications, where you're a passive investor in LP, limited partner, limited liability. And that's the beauty of investing in syndications and private placements. I would say maybe separate those two holdings in separate entities. Certainly separate your LP holdings from if you have a real operational business. So we had an investor, they ran a custodial company, operational business, high liability. They got employees. There's a lot of risks there, relatively speaking. And whatever you do, don't put your passive investment holdings in the same LLC. Just create a new LLC. It should be pretty cheap to do, $500, $1,000 to create one of these entities. That said, I would stay away from filing this on your own or doing the legal Zoom, rent a LLC document from the internet method. Personally, what I do is I always have my lawyer make this for me, and it shouldn't be that expensive. It shouldn't cost more than a couple grand on the high end to do one of these activities. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is we're saying in step 2 is separate your real estate from yourself once it gets to a certain stage. Whereas step 1 is separating yourself from your business activities, just to highlight that nuance. Both are using LLCs or different entities that are separate from you. A lot of us might come already on the second or third floor of the wealth elevator. So both of these might apply to you, and what's on the next slide might apply to you. But if you're thinking sequentially as you're trying to build up your net worth, this is how, personally speaking, I started from no net worth For a while there, I didn't have any LLCs, so I violated a lot of what I'm talking about here. But then again, I didn't have anything to lose, right? As a kid with under $500,000 net worth in my 20s, I wasn't a big target. And spending a few $1,000s to create these entities was maybe the cash flow for one of my properties, one of those turnkey rentals back then. Again, no excuse for doing that, but that's just what I did. So I guess a little bit of do what I say, not what I do in a way. But of course, take this information and have a good educated conversation with your own CPA and attorney. This would be a good time to show you some real application of this. This is actually what my entity structure when I had 11 rental properties and was starting to get into syndications and private placements. Obviously, a lot of these structures have changed as my net worth have grown and become more elaborate entity structure. But what you're seeing here on the right side is upper right-hand corner is where all my little rental properties were. Again, these are relatively high liability. And what I had was a little tree of LLCs. So I had my Georgia rentals in one LLC and my Alabama and Indiana rental in another LLC, and those got pulled into another LLC. And you're going to hear a term thrown around a lot called the hold co. In a way that Kanaka LLC there, which was filed in Delaware, was my hold code there, where the other two entities were filed in that wherever the rental properties were, in this case, Georgia, and then Alabama. And then we just did Indiana, one in there, Indiana property there for, we could have made a third LLC, but this is where you need to sometimes balance, what makes sense from a money standpoint to put this stuff together, or headache. There are probably about 4 or 5 different arrangements of just protecting these 11 properties. You could just throw them into one holding company. You could also throw it into the state that you're living in. But this to go to show that there's so many ways you can do it. This is just one working model for this. None of this is tax or legal advice. On that right side, you can think of that more as passive income from a tax standpoint. And then on the left side is more of my ordinary income, right? Like at this point, I started to become a business owner. We started to syndicate deals 2016. So you start to see how I would take over the LP side and the GP side. So I think that's a little bit different, right? This would be no different than if you own your own practice, own your own business. A little bit different application, but I'm just putting this out there as like an personal example and ways for you to start to think about things. And one way to think about it, and it doesn't always align well with taxes, but you have to blend the two. And it's nice when your tax attorney and your lawyer are both on the same page. Sometimes it's really worth to spend $500 an hour for one guy and $500 for the other guy to sit on a call for 30 minutes. Be careful with that. They love to do that and BS with each other on those calls and burn up your money, but sometimes it can make a lot of sense. So let's go back to the theory of this. So we talked about creating entities. Step 3 here is establish a holding company. And that was what I was mentioning over here that I was doing myself, which is this entity, and operational company was on this side. So that there was some kind of consolidation happening. And also these entities were filed in a little bit more business friendly states such as Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. You need to categorize your holdings into risky and safe. So risky ones are more like rental properties, your operational business. Your safe holdings are your stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and probably your passive LP syndication holdings too. Try not to commingle them into one, because if the dirty, risky liability assets have an issue, it's going to bring the safe ones into it too. The idea is you try and silo all your entities. We hope nothing happens, but if one thing were to get blown up or called under question in a litigation, then the other ones are free from that and separated. If not anything, starting out at the top, the settlement amount goes way, way down. All right, you've spent several $1,000s to create these entities, and you've got your little PowerPoint slide deck to be able to discuss things with your CPA and your lawyer, and you're feeling really good. But step four here is respecting your entity structure, basically treating it like a business and doing all the filings, the taxes, and separate bank accounts, separate credit cards for those bank accounts, and always acting as a manager on behalf of the company, not personally, to maintain the separation. Basically, don't screw up the cool thing that you made. If you ever went as far as a litigation and full discovery, they may go back and look at your ledger and look for instances when you're commingling funds and not really using this entity as it's a true separate person of you or separate part of this business, and may use that to call into question your entire entity structure and go after other things that are outside. Have that in the back of your mind. Of course, great time to also explain that if you're doing anything fraudulent, criminal, all this blows up all this stuff. Doesn't really protect you. And I think we would all hope that's the case with all of us being law abiding citizens, trying to do things the right way. But we live in an unfortunately litigious world that we have to do these types of things to protect ourselves and our family. At this point, we've stepped up to this bluer level in terms of how much we have to lose or asset level. And we're getting into these outer rings and a little bit more of these exotic strategies. Up until this point, from a asset protection strategy, you're implementing basic entities. And especially if you have kids, this is not quite of a asset protection thing, but it's just you need to have a living trust, revocable trust. That gets put in as soon as you have a kid, at the very least, or especially when your net worth goes over $500,000 I would think. And what this does, it avoids probate, which probate is this kind of nasty process that goes through where all your stuff is aired out and it takes a while for your heirs to get your money. Now, it's something that everybody delays doing because they don't want to think about their demise, but it's not really like some people are attacking your money. And this is more like in case you died to protect against that side. So think of this as more of a side, right? If you have a kid, your net worth is over 500,000, you should have had your revocable trust, living trust done yesterday. Revocable trusts only offer a layer of anonymity, meaning when you go to probate, all your stuff doesn't get aired out publicly. It has no liability protection. I will say that again. No liability protection, meaning that it does diddly squat when you get sued. All it is the directions of where your money goes to. Now, if you want asset protection, you need to have what's called an irrevocable trust, which, as the name suggests, it is irrevocable. You can't really change it. And think of it as outside of your estate. You may be the beneficiary of this trust, but if somebody were to come and attack you from a legal standpoint, it's going to be a lot harder, if not impossible, to get at the assets within that irrevocable trust. If you're keying in on this, as I did when I was stepping up the floors of the wealth elevator myself, the irrevocable trust is like this cheat code in a way. The problem with it is pretty expensive. You're going to be expecting to pay 10, 20, maybe even $50,000 to set one of these things up. If that sounds like a lot of money to you, you probably don't have enough assets to protect, or you're super cheap and you need to change that mindset. And I think that's where you need to get around other accredited investors within our community. That's why we have the family office Ohana Mastermind group. We allow people to come to the retreat to test us out. But I would say you really need to have at least a handful of accredited investors around you to start thinking this way, and to, especially for like asset protection, right? How do you structure your entities? It's hard to have these types of conversations with your buddies and your coworkers because it's about money. And most times they are in a much lower financial level than you are listening to this type of content. There's a lot of names for these irrevocable trusts. It can often be very confusing. And to add a layer of confusion to that, there are a lot of these legal promoters out there that like to use a lot of cool names out there for these irrevocable trusts or revocable trusts to make it sound like the Cadillac of entities for your asset protection. Don't be fooled by all the bells and whistles and the names, especially. A lot of these are just marketable terms. Much like you'll hear for simple solo 401k will be called all kinds of different marketable trademark terms, but they're all the same damn thing. Now, if your net worth is a few million, 5 million, $10 million plus, or you run your own dental practice where you have a lot of high liability coming from your business, it might make sense to put together what is irrevocable trust or even go offshore. And another side strategy would be to implement equity stripping, where you're commingling your assets with loans that are senior to any litigation. Now, this is something that I put into practice, but later on learned that it may not be the most effective thing when a lawsuit does come up. Again, it's just another strategy out there to have a conversation with your CPA. If not, the offshore aspect of some of these trusts also create another deterrent and barrier. And that's what all these things are. None of these things are foolproof. Some of these things they may or may not work. Like Series LLC, there's really not a lot of good case law behind that. It's a little bit untested. But if you can stack these multiple strategies on top of each other, that's really what's going to protect you at the end of the day. Again, the analogy is you're trying to build a castle. You may geek out on having a big moat, but what if your people coming through are really good swimmers? You're screwed, right? You would have wished you would have spent the money on the archers. But I think what we're trying to say here is try and build your asset protection strategy with a good amount of these lower level strategies and maybe some of the more exotic stuff at the top. The last thing here is to review and adjust your asset protection strategy. That's why I have mines on a PowerPoint slide so it can change and I can plan for the future because this is a moving type of diagram that's going to change. And also laws change. For example, right now, Congress is fighting the grantor trust aspect with an irrevocable trust, which right now is a great way of paying less taxes in these trusts, but also really strong asset protection. So to have your cake and eat it too. It's one of those known things out there in the more advanced asset protection tax strategies that are coming under fire. Hopefully it just the ball gets kicked on it for forever. It's just an example of things change. Just in the tax world, a lot of us did those land conservation easements, and then the omnibus bill came and we moved away from that strategy as it became a little bit more risky. But I think this is where, again, you got to get around other accredited investors who are implementing these types of strategies, having good conversations with them. But as you can see, a lot of this is very private, especially asset protection, especially how your entity diagram is put together. Obviously, it's not something you want to put on the internet or in a masterclass, right? Like this. But that's why I always say get around at least 5 people that you can build a relationship over time. And that's why ultimately why people join our family office, Ohana Mastermind, our inner circle, so they can be in a safe environment to build relationships with other people. We're talking with the next generation when your kids are old enough. Some would say even 12, they would sit down with their kids and they would put this entity diagram on the board and then say, hey, Simba, this is what you own. This is your horizon right here. This is how all these entities make money. This is how we're protected. Maybe this line we want to get rid of and then we'll augment it this way. This is a great way of mind mapping out and sharing this information with the next generation for them to take the baton. I never had this conversation with my parents, probably because there wasn't jack really to give, and it was just simple. All they had was stuff here in the middle, all your traditional stuff. If my parents would have had something like this, I would have really loved it. And this would have been obviously turned into huge interest and passion that I would have had in the future. If not offer a sense of security, but also provides a little bit of anti-entitlement too, right? This can be taken away. This can be sued, and this may not be here forever. They understand the risks of owning these types of assets and how it can be taken away and how they need to just keep putting their foot to the pedal and keep moving forward and growing the family's legacy and net worth. And obviously this gets into more softer subjects. And this is why you need to get around other people. These aren't the conversations you have with your lawyer or your tax attorney. They're just there to set up your entities and to help you when there's a problem. Just healthcare. Nobody really talks about optimizing health. They just talk to you when you get a sickness. In this case, you need your peer group around you to help grow the legacy and expand it. in the same sense. The last thing here that I'll mention is a fraudulent conveyance. You guys can Google that word later. But if you are putting these entities into place after litigation, a lot of that is seen as you doing things after the fact. And at that point, it's too late. And in reality, a judge or lawyers will unravel that. So the idea is putting the stuff into place before the issue comes up. And when we're on a topic of legal protection, a couple side notes, your retirement funds, your life insurance. That's why we all do the infinite banking, accredited investor banking. Money in there is typically safer, depending on what your states are. Check your specific state, send an email to bank@thewealthelevator.com. That can be part of your legal strategy. As I use the analogy, when your assets is put into an irrevocable trust, that is pretty dang secure at that point. Even a regular entity, right? You're putting it into its own silo. In a way, think of it like you're putting it into the house or putting it into the safe in the basement. When assets are in cash or you're paying off your house, depending on which state you're in, paying off your house and having all the equity could be one of the dumbest things that you could be doing. You're sitting duck. Everybody knows how much you have and it's right there and they can go after it. Certain states are a little bit more asset protected for your house, such as Florida, but other states, I mean, I think in Hawaii, your only first 50 grand is protected in your primary residence. So it's smarter to have a mortgage, encumber yourself with debt in that way. If you don't own any rental properties, you're probably like, yes, stepping over that adolescent step of that first floor of the wealth elevator and going straight to the second and third or higher. This would be a good way of thinking about it. So first is on the left side here is more of within your estate. The right side is more of the advanced stuff, more of the irrevocable side. For now, just ignore this portion right here, right? This would be a great starting point to, of course, have a conversation with your own attorney. But first thing, this is yourself, right? You might have an LLC where you have your holding company, and then you would put your investments into here. So that's on this more passive side, lower liability side. Now, a lot of you guys have businesses, whether it's a high liability medical practice or a low liability side gig, sell stuff on eBay. Maybe your spouse sells things on Etsy, makes little crafts on the weekend. This would be that entity, that LLC that would hold this side gig business. Notice we're not really talking about one way or the other, whether you're doing it as an LLC, S Corp, C Corp. That's more of a tax distinction. I'm just talking about just entities for now. This would be an example of separating the lower liability stuff from the high liability stuff here. If you don't have any operational business, cool. You just got your passive stuff here. This would be a good starting point for somebody who's a few $1,000,000 or higher. A lot of investors, I would say most of them just invest in the passive syndications as a LP and sign on behalf of their own personal name too. I'm just using this as an example. And then of course you've got your life insurance from that goes directly to your own name because again, life insurance generally is asset protected to begin with, along with your other retirement accounts. At some point, when your net worth gets higher and you have more to lose, you might want to put in this irrevocable trust structure, if not anything to get out of the estate tax thresholds. And estate tax thresholds will change over the years. I think this starts to kick in right now around $25 million, which seems like a lot, but for most of us who are in our 40s and 50s with a few $1,000,000 net worth, by the time you're in your 70s and 80s, you got to believe just with pure inflation, and even if you put it into some lower return type of vehicle like life insurance, and you continue to make and save money, your net worth is going to go over 8 figures. And who knows what Congress is going to do with the estate tax threshold? It may come way down and may put these types of situations where, yeah, you want to get your money outside of your estate to hide under those estate tax thresholds, if not only for asset protection at that point when your net worth goes over 5 to 10 million. As I said before, there's all these marketable, cool terms that all mean the same thing. It's some kind of spin on an irrevocable trust. Irrevocable trust You can build them as a grantor, non-grantor, who's the trustee, who's the beneficiary. Yeah, I think this is where it gets really confusing and might go beyond the scope of most investors out there. And this is where you have to really work with a good tax attorney who's not going to fleece you on the pricing. And that's why if you're looking in the market for one of these things, your net worth is over a few million. I think that's why you got to join the family office on a mastermind, guys, right? Like you have to interact with other people putting these entity structures into place. But this is how you might put one of these things together. The trust has its own investment LLC. Again, that's a similar structure of a holding company. And that's where you may put other investments in. And then it has its own bank account. And you may even take it a step further if you have your own primary residence in your trust, especially if you live in a place like Hawaii where the protection limits are pretty low, opposite being Florida, where you want to put that primary residence in the trust. And then you do some type of structure where you rent yourself and you pay your trust from your personal side. And this is where, as we mentioned earlier, you got to get the paperwork right. You have to uphold these things. If you're renting your primary residence from your trust, you better show the paper trail of the money going to your trust as rent payments. And of course, pay the taxes on behalf of the trust if it's grantor or non-grantor. So it gets a little confusing, right? And obviously confusion creates more costs too. So you have to weigh the differences between, do you want to do one of these things or just want to keep it simple, but be somewhat exposed? This is a lot more nicer looking. And just an example of what I showed in the other slides. You can do things of a myriad of different ways, right? None of this is legal advice. This is just different ways that you can build the skeleton. The way I would read this is you've got yourself. Self was here in this diagram, but the self is here in this individual. And you've got this guy might have a rental property here and it goes to him individually, which may not be the best practice method, but it is what it is. But this real estate is put into here and this LLC is here. And then they've got their infinite banking and 401k. This one has the hold code. The way that I think that's a general best practice is have it go into a holding LLC. And then this one's got a separate holding LLC for their more safe investments. The reason that they would do this is now you have separate bank accounts. It's just cleaner. And I think sometimes we think of managing this on our own, but for all we know, we could just die tomorrow and our spouse and our kids have to pick up pieces. And if you already have this stuff set up and already in a trust, then it's easy for them to get moving and not skip a beat. So these are, I would say, common structures for people that are under 3 million. These are over 3 million to 5 million, or people with higher liability professions like doctors. This might be similar to what we showed earlier, where the passive syndications are in a holding LLC, which is owned by a trust. And then also the infinite banking, your life insurance is put into the trust, or infinite banking could be just put into individual, like we said, because generally speaking, the life insurance is asset protected depending on which state you're in. If you really wanted to geek out on this stuff, you can put life insurance in trust. It's called an ILET. Not a lot of people do it right now because the state tax thresholds are relatively high, as I mentioned earlier, but maybe it comes back down and this becomes more of a common arrangement where they put the life insurance in the trust for tax reasons. But hopefully that demystifies a little bit of the layering strategy. Again, have a conversation with your attorney, but also have a conversation with other purely passive accredited investors. But the only way you're going to get is to build real organic relationships from them. Nobody just shows their Google Sheet, Google PowerPoint diagram of all their entity. It's rather sensitive information. You build a relationship with people over time, and that's how we format the events, right? People come down, they spend some time with each other, and they grow the relationship over years. And I think that's what makes this journey a lot more funner when you do it with other people. One quick discussion on entity structures when you're investing as a syndication. This is within a syndication, how some of that's structured. A lot of this is encompassed in the black box within the syndication holding. But there's a few different ways syndicators, operators will set these things up, but they'll typically have the asset in a holding company and might be a series of these LLCs. But essentially, what happens is there's a private placement memorandum operating agreement, and there is a split structure put into place. Of course, a myriad of other things in there too. But this is where knowing investors will go in on you hear class A, B, and C, and those are just arbitrary letters. You can make it XYZ, 8MYC, whatever. It doesn't even matter what the letter is. I think in one of my deals, I actually made it as the Mercedes. You got your C class, you got your S class, you got your E class. But I think that just confused people. But that is the shareholders in here. And then you have your general partnership, which could be class A, could be class F. It doesn't really matter, but those are your manager level people. Sometimes that will be a separate LLC where the different general partners are put into there with their rights and their control rights. This is typically where I will be in there with other partners that can control the asset on behalf of everybody. If you're thinking just for yourself, how does it tie into my personal strategy? You're in typically these holdings right here, the common equity holdings. And that what goes into your own structure. But being a passive investor has a lot of good perks. The biggest one of being if you're not signing a recourse on the debt, any liability gets firewalled from you. If anything, there's any lawsuits, it comes to the manager's side, whereas that's the beauty of being an LP. But with that is the end of this module. Yeah, I think it is rather confusing. The first time you hear this stuff, it might go over your head. We've got some other videos just to push the point home, spoken in a few different ways and methods. But if you guys need a referral to a tax lawyer person, because we're always very clear, we're not giving any tax or legal advice here. I'm just here sharing my own experience of my journey. We can help you guys out with that. As CPAs and lawyers, there were people we refer out to have changed over the years, but we live in a dynamic world. And I think that's again why you guys need to learn this stuff to a certain extent, but also have a community around you of people also dynamically improving themselves.